There's a children's book version of Johnny Appleseed that most Americans grow up with. You probably know it. A gentle eccentric wandering the frontier, barefoot and smiling, scattering apple seeds like confetti at a parade. A tin pot on his head. A sack over his shoulder. A friend to every squirrel and songbird. The kind of wholesome, harmless character who belongs on a classroom poster next to George Washington and his cherry tree. It's a nice story. Clean. Simple. The kind of tale that makes you feel good about American pioneers and manifest destiny and the taming of the wild continent. Johnny Appleseed, the benevolent wanderer, bringing civilization one apple tree at a time. But here's the thing about stories that are too clean. They're usually covering up something messy. The real John Chapman, the man behind the myth, was born in 1774 in Massachusetts. He did travel west. He did plant apple trees. Thousands of them, across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and beyond. But the version we tell children leaves out almost everything interesting. It sands down the sharp edges. It makes him cute instead of strange. Harmless instead of unsettling. Because the truth is, Johnny Appleseed wasn't some cheerful gardener spreading joy and fruit. He was a man who chose to walk alone into territories so wild that even hardened frontiersmen hesitated. He slept in forests where wolves howled. He crossed lands where conflicts between settlers and native tribes turned violent without warning. He owned almost nothing, refused money, rejected every offer of comfort or companionship. And he did all of this not for profit, not for recognition, not for any reason that made sense to the people around him. He just kept walking. Kept planting. Kept moving deeper into the wilderness. So let me ask you the question nobody asks in the children's books. Why would a man spend 40 years of his life walking alone through some of the most dangerous, isolated, unforgiving terrain in America just to plant seeds? Seeds that wouldn't bear fruit for years. Seeds he'd never see grow into trees. Seeds that serve no immediate purpose to anyone. What makes a man do that? What was Johnny Appleseed really looking for out there in the wild? And more importantly, what did he find? If you met John Chapman in person, you wouldn't have thought he was charming. You would have thought he was broken. Historical accounts describe him as disheveled, often filthy, wearing a coffee sack with holes cut for his arms and legs. Sometimes barefoot even in winter. Sometimes wearing one shoe. His hair was long and matted. He spoke little. When he did speak, it was often in strange, fragmented sentences about seeds and soil and things that didn't make sense to frontier families just trying to survive. He refused money. Not in the noble way you might imagine, but in a way that made people uncomfortable. Settlers would offer him payment for his seedlings and he'd wave them off, mumbling something about debts being paid in other ways. He'd show up at a homestead, plant a nursery, and disappear before anyone could properly thank him or compensate him. He rejected property ownership, even though the Homestead Act would have given him land for free. He could have claimed thousands of acres. Could have become wealthy. Instead, he'd lease small plots, plant his nurseries, and move on before the lease expired. As if the idea of owning land was somehow offensive to him. People thought he was simple-minded. A holy fool, maybe. Or just a fool. The kind of man who makes you cross the street when you see him coming, not because you're afraid of violence, but because you're afraid of the conversation. Afraid of whatever strange energy he's carrying. Afraid that whatever broke inside him might be contagious. But here's what nobody could explain. Johnny Appleseed wasn't aimless. His routes were deliberate. His nurseries were strategically placed along rivers, near future settlements, in areas that would become vital to westward expansion. He wasn't wandering randomly. He was following something. Reading something in the land that others couldn't see. And there was his obsession with seeds. Not just any apple seeds. Specific seeds. He'd travel hundreds of miles to collect seeds from particular orchards, from particular trees. He'd spend weeks drying them, sorting them, preparing them with a care that bordered on ritualistic. Settlers who watched him work said it looked less like farming and more like prayer. Then there were the stories. Quiet stories, the kind people told around fires but never wrote down. Stories about Johnny walking into territories where no white man should have survived. Stories about him sleeping in the open during blizzards and waking up unharmed. Stories about Native American tribes, some of them openly hostile to settlers, treating Johnny with a kind of cautious respect. Never harming him. Sometimes even guiding him. One account, buried in a county historical society record, describes a frontier family watching Johnny approach a black bear on a trail. The bear stood up, looked at him, and simply walked away. Not ran. Walked. As if it recognized him. As if it understood he didn't belong to the category of men who should be feared or chased off. The family asked Johnny about it later. He shrugged and said something like, "She knows I'm not taking anything that isn't offered." What does that mean? Not taking anything that isn't offered? Offered by whom? By what? People in settlement started to talk about Johnny Appleseed the way you talk about someone who's touched. Not dangerous, exactly. But not entirely in the world anymore either. Like he'd crossed some invisible boundary and couldn't quite come back. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to come back. To understand what Johnny Appleseed was responding to, you have to understand what the American wilderness was like in the early 1800s. Not the wilderness we imagine today, with its hiking trails and visitor centers and carefully managed ecosystems. The real wilderness. The one that existed before maps, before roads, before the vast forests were cut down and the rivers dammed and the land divided into neat squares of property. This was a landscape that had its own logic. Old-growth forests so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. Trees that had been standing for 500 years, 1,000 years. Root systems that connected across miles like neural networks. Forests where you could walk for weeks without seeing another human being, where the silence was so total it felt alive. Indigenous peoples had been living in these lands for millennia, of course. They had their own maps, their own understandings, their own agreements with the wild. But even they spoke of certain places with caution. Sacred groves. Forbidden territories. Areas where the boundary between the human world and something older grew thin. And into this wilderness walked John Chapman. Alone. Carrying nothing but his seeds and a Bible and whatever strange conviction was driving him forward. The historical record tells us he'd walk for months at a time. Spring through fall, sometimes into early winter. He'd follow rivers, follow game trails, follow paths that seemed to appear just when he needed them. Settlers who encountered him on these journeys said he moved through the forest like he was reading it. Like every bent branch and animal track was a sentence in a language only he could understand. There are accounts, documented in frontier diaries, of Johnny showing up at isolated homesteads after weeks in the wild, looking healthier than when he left. Not worn down by the journey, but somehow nourished by it. As if the wilderness itself was sustaining him. One particularly detailed account comes from a missionary named William Brock, who encountered Johnny in the Ohio Territory in 1812. Brock was traveling with a small group, well-armed, nervous about recent conflicts in the area. They ran into Johnny on a trail, walking alone, unarmed, seemingly unconcerned. Brock wrote in his journal that Johnny spoke to them about the land as if it were a living thing. Not in a poetic metaphor kind of way, but matter-of-factly. He talked about which valleys welcomed settlers and which ones resisted. He warned them away from a particular river crossing, saying it wasn't ready for them yet. Brock, a rational man, found the whole interaction deeply unsettling. But he also noted that they followed Johnny's advice and later heard that another group who ignored similar warnings had encountered disaster at that exact crossing. Coincidence? Maybe. But there are too many stories like this. Too many accounts of Johnny knowing things he shouldn't have known. Predicting weather patterns with uncanny accuracy. Warning of conflicts before they happened. Appearing in places at exactly the right time, as if he'd been summoned. And then there were the animals. This is where the accounts start to sound less like history and more like folklore, but they're documented nonetheless. Multiple sources describe animals behaving strangely around Johnny Appleseed. Not just the bear incident. Wolves following him at a distance but never approaching. Birds landing near him and staying, as if listening. Deer watching him pass without fleeing. A settler woman named Rebecca Hayes wrote in 1818 about watching Johnny plant a nursery near her family's cabin. She said he worked in complete silence for hours, and during that entire time, a red fox sat at the edge of the clearing, just watching. When Johnny finished and walked away, the fox followed him into the forest. Her husband dismissed it. Animals do strange things, he said. But Rebecca wrote that it felt like something else. Like the fox was escorting him. Like it had been waiting for him. Some men domesticate the land. They impose their will on it, force it into submission, bend it to human purposes. But there's another way to be in the wild. An older way. You can ask permission. You can listen. You can try to understand the agreements that existed before you arrived. Johnny Appleseed wasn't conquering the wilderness. He was negotiating with it. And somehow, impossibly, it was answering him back. Here's something the children's books never mention. The apples Johnny Appleseed planted weren't meant to be eaten. Most of his trees produced fruit that was small, sour, barely edible. These weren't the sweet dessert apples we know today. They were spitters. Bitter, astringent things that would make your mouth pucker. The kind of apples you'd feed to livestock if you were desperate, but never choose to eat yourself. So what were they for? Hard cider. Applejack. Alcohol. The frontier ran on alcohol, and apples were the most reliable way to produce it. Johnny Appleseed wasn't spreading wholesome orchards for families to pick fruit on autumn afternoons. He was planting the raw material for frontier distilleries and homestead brewing operations. But even that explanation doesn't quite work. Because Johnny's trees kept showing up in strange places. Places that made no agricultural sense. Clearings so remote that no settler would find them for years. Hidden valleys. Places where the soil was wrong, where conventional wisdom said apple trees shouldn't grow at all. And yet they grew anyway. Johnny's trees thrived in locations where they should have failed. They grew faster than they should have. They spread in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the trees themselves were choosing where to take root. Frontier families started to notice something odd about certain orchards. The ones Johnny had planted years earlier, the ones that had been left alone to grow wild. People would avoid them. Not consciously at first. Just a vague discomfort. A sense that something about those particular groves felt off. There are scattered accounts in county records and family histories of pioneers camping near Johnny's old nurseries and having disturbing dreams. Vivid, intense dreams that multiple people would have simultaneously. Dreams about the forest before settlement, about the land as it used to be, about agreements that had been broken. One account, documented in an Indiana county history from 1876, describes a family who cleared land that included one of Johnny's older orchards. They cut down most of the trees but left a few. That first winter, they reported hearing sounds in the grove. Not wind. Not animals. Something else. A kind of low humming that seemed to come from the trees themselves. They finally cut down the remaining trees out of sheer unease, and the sound stopped. Superstition? Probably. But the accounts keep appearing. Different families, different locations, similar stories. Orchards that felt wrong. Trees that seemed to watch. A persistent sense of being unwelcome in groves that Johnny had planted. And then there's the way he planted them. Multiple witnesses described Johnny's planting method as ritualistic. He wouldn't just dig a hole and drop in seeds. He'd spend time at each location first. Walking the perimeter. Touching the soil. Sometimes standing still for long periods, as if listening for something. A circuit rider preacher named Joseph Griggs wrote about watching Johnny plant a nursery in 1820. Griggs noted that Johnny arranged the seeds in specific patterns, muttering words in a language Griggs didn't recognize. When Griggs asked about it, Johnny said he was asking permission and making introductions. Griggs assumed he was talking about prayer, but the words didn't sound like any prayer Griggs had heard before. What was Johnny introducing? The seeds to the soil? The trees to the land? Or something else? Was he mediating between the cultivated and the wild? Between the world the settlers were building and the world that existed before? The more you look into the specific locations of Johnny's nurseries, the stranger the pattern becomes. Many of them correspond to places that indigenous peoples considered significant. Not sacred sites exactly, but boundary places. Liminal spaces. Areas where, according to tribal oral histories, careful respect was required. It's as if Johnny was deliberately placing his trees in locations where the barrier between civilization and wilderness was thinnest. Creating a network of orchards that weren't just agricultural. They were something else. Markers, maybe. Or offerings. The apples weren't the point. The trees were the message. And Johnny Appleseed was delivering that message to something that had been in the American wilderness long before the first settler arrived and would remain long after the last one left. I've been researching Johnny Appleseed for 3 years now. Started as a curiosity, became an obsession. The further you dig into primary sources, the further you get from the friendly eccentric of American folklore and the closer you get to something much stranger. Let me share some of the accounts I've found. Make of them what you will. From the Diary of Margaret Wheeler, 1825, Ohio Territory, the strange orchard man came by today. Father offered him supper and a bed but he refused both, saying he'd already eaten and had somewhere to sleep, though there's nothing but forest for 15 miles in any direction. He sat with us briefly and told the children stories, though I couldn't follow them. Something about old agreements and patient things. He left before sunset, walking north into the deep woods. The dogs watched him go but wouldn't follow, which isn't like them at all. I asked Father if we should worry about him spending the night in the wild. Father said no. He said somehow he knew the man would be fine. I don't know how Father knew that, but I felt it too. From a letter written by Samuel Cobb to his brother, 1829, I'm telling you this because you'll think I've lost my mind, but I swear on Mother's grave it happened. I was tracking a deer through dense forest, lost the trail, couldn't find my way back to camp. Spent 2 days wandering, getting more lost. Was starting to panic, water running low, when I saw him. That Johnny Appleseed fellow everyone talks about. He didn't say a word, just nodded at me and started walking. I followed. After maybe an hour, he stopped at the edge of a clearing, pointed toward the far side, and then just walked back into the forest. I crossed the clearing and found my camp, right where he'd pointed. When I turned around to thank him, he was already gone. Couldn't see him anywhere. Here's the strange part. The clearing he led me through wasn't there when I walked back the next day to mark the trail. Just solid forest. No clearing at all. From an oral history recorded in 1891, told by an elderly Shawnee woman named Falling Leaf, translated by her grandson, the white men came and took much from us. But there was one who walked differently. He carried seeds and planted them, but he always asked first. We watched him speak to the land. He used old words, words that even we had mostly forgotten. Our elders said he had been taught by something in the deep forest, before he came west. They said he was trying to maintain the old agreements, the ones between the land and those who walk on it. He understood that the earth is not something you own. It is something you belong to, if you're willing to pay the price of belonging. We left him alone because he left us alone, and because the forest seemed to accept him. That is rare for a white man. From a frontier doctor's journal, 1833, Indiana, treated a young man today who claimed to have encountered Johnny Appleseed deep in uncharted forest, miles from any settlement. The man, whose name I'll withhold, said he was hunting alone when he came upon a clearing where Johnny was planting. But here's what disturbs me. The young man described Johnny as surrounded by animals. Not just nearby, but surrounding him in a circle. Deer, foxes, even what he swears was a mountain lion. All of them just sitting there, watching Johnny work. The young man said he hid and observed for nearly an hour, and during that entire time, the animals didn't move. Didn't interact. Just watched. When Johnny finished and walked away, the animals dispersed. The young man is not prone to exaggeration and showed no signs of fever or delirium, but I hardly know what to make of this account. From a settler's diary, 1838, strange occurrence today. Was clearing land on the new property when we found one of those old Johnny Appleseed nurseries, must be 10 years old at least, trees all grown wild. Decided to keep a few, cut the rest. But when we started cutting, the whole crew got this feeling. Hard to describe. Like we were being watched. Like we shouldn't be there. One man swore he heard his name spoken, but there was no one else around. We finished the job, but every man said later they'd felt it too. Something in those trees that didn't want us there. We left the remaining trees standing and haven't been back to that part of the property since. These accounts are scattered across dozens of archives, county historical societies, family records. They're rarely dramatic. No monsters, no explicit supernatural events. Just this persistent sense that Johnny Appleseed existed in a space between worlds. That he'd found a way to communicate with something most people couldn't even perceive. The pattern that emerges isn't of a man planting trees. It's of a mediator. Someone who understood that the American wilderness wasn't empty land waiting to be civilized. It was occupied. Had always been occupied. By ecosystems, yes, by indigenous peoples, yes. But also by something older and harder to name. A presence. An awareness. And Johnny Appleseed, for reasons we'll never fully understand, had learned how to acknowledge that presence. How to make offerings to it. How to negotiate with it. The trees were his language. The seeds were his prayers. And the wilderness, impossibly, was listening. But let's be clear about something. This wasn't a happy story. Whatever Johnny Appleseed found in the wilderness, whatever agreement he'd made, it came with a cost. The historical record shows a man who lived in almost complete isolation. He had no wife, no children, no permanent home. He owned nothing. He formed no lasting relationships. He was, by all conventional measures, utterly alone. Accounts from people who knew him describe a man who seemed increasingly disconnected from normal human concerns. He'd show up at a settlement after months in the wild and seem confused by basic social interactions. He'd forget to eat. He'd stand in one spot for hours, staring at trees or rivers or nothing at all. In his later years, witnesses reported that he seemed almost translucent. Not literally, but there was something faded about him. As if he was becoming less solid, less present. As if the wilderness was slowly absorbing him. He ignored his health. There are accounts of him walking on frostbitten feet, working through fevers, disregarding injuries that should have stopped him. It wasn't bravery, exactly. It was more like he couldn't feel those things anymore. Or he felt them but they didn't matter compared to whatever compulsion was driving him. One particularly haunting account comes from a frontier woman named Elizabeth Brewer, who wrote in 1842 that Johnny Appleseed had stopped at her family's farm, looking gaunt and ill. They'd insisted he stay the night, rest, eat properly. He'd agreed reluctantly, as if he'd forgotten how to accept hospitality. Elizabeth wrote that during dinner, her young daughter had asked Johnny if he had a family. He'd looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to remember what the word meant, and then said, "I suppose I do. But they're scattered across more miles than you could walk in a lifetime, and most of them never had names." What does that mean? Who was he talking about? The trees? The places he'd been? Or had he, in his decades alone in the wilderness, come to think of the land itself as family? There's a phrase that appears in a few of the accounts I've found. Different witnesses use slightly different wording, but the meaning is the same. They describe Johnny as someone who couldn't stay. Not wouldn't, couldn't. As if remaining in one place caused him physical pain. As if the agreement he'd made required constant motion, constant wandering. One man, a tavern keeper in Ohio, described Johnny stopping at his establishment for a meal. The man said Johnny kept glancing at the door, kept standing up and sitting back down, kept touching the walls as if they were closing in on him. After 20 minutes, Johnny left his food half-eaten and walked out without a word. The tavern keeper said it looked less like restlessness and more like panic. Like being indoors, being enclosed, being separated from the wild was suffocating him. And there's this. In the last decade of his life, multiple accounts describe Johnny's skin taking on a strange texture. Like bark. Not literally bark, but rougher than normal human skin, with patterns that reminded people of tree bark. Settlers who shook his hand commented on it. Said it felt more like touching wood than touching flesh. Was this just the result of decades of exposure to the elements? Probably. But in the context of everything else, it feels symbolic. As if Johnny Appleseed was literally becoming part of the landscape he devoted his life to. The wilderness accepts many bargains. It offers many gifts to those willing to listen. But none of them are free. The price might be comfort, or connection, or sanity, or identity itself. The price might be everything that makes you human. And Johnny Appleseed, it seems, paid in full. There's a melancholy to this part of the story. Because whatever truth Johnny found in the wild, whatever communication he established with the old places, it cost him the ability to exist among his own kind. He became a translator between two worlds, but the act of translation left him belonging to neither. He'd chosen to hear something most people couldn't hear. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Once you've made that kind of agreement, you can't unmake it. You can only keep walking. Keep planting. Keep paying the price, year after year, until your body gives out or the land itself decides it's had enough of you. The forest accepts many bargains. But it doesn't let you go once you've signed up. Johnny Appleseed learned that truth the way all intermediaries do. Slowly. Irrevocably. With every step deeper into the wild. The official record says John Chapman died on March 18, 1845, near Fort Wayne, Indiana. He was 70 years old. He'd contracted pneumonia after spending a winter walking, as always, through territories most people avoided. He died at a friend's cabin, was buried in a local cemetery, and that should be the end of the story. But of course, it isn't. The accounts of his final days are contradictory. Some say he died peacefully. Others say he seemed agitated, kept trying to get up and leave, even in his final hours. One witness claimed his last words were something about unfinished plantings, about seeds that still needed to be delivered. Another said he died silent, staring out a window at the forest beyond. His grave was marked. Then the cemetery was moved due to development. Then the grave was lost. There are now 3 different locations that claim to be Johnny Appleseed's final resting place. None of them can be verified with certainty. But here's what's stranger. In the years following his death, people kept reporting sightings of Johnny Appleseed. Not ghosts exactly. Just glimpses. A figure matching his description, walking through forests in Ohio. In Michigan. In places he'd never been during his lifetime. An 1847 newspaper account from Illinois describes a surveying crew encountering a man they swore was Johnny Appleseed, 2 years after his death. They called out to him. He looked at them, nodded, and walked into the forest. They followed but found no trace of him. In 1852, a family traveling west wrote about stopping at an abandoned homestead and finding a fresh nursery. Young apple trees, planted in Johnny's distinctive pattern. The nearest settlement was 40 miles away. No one had been to that property in years. Who planted those trees? More accounts surfaced through the 1850s and 60s. Always in remote areas. Always just glimpses. A figure moving through trees. An orchard appearing where none had been before. Travelers feeling a presence in the forests, something watching them, something old and patient. You could dismiss all of this as folklore, as the natural mythologizing that happens around unusual historical figures. People wanted Johnny Appleseed to be more than he was, so they invented stories about him. Claimed to see him. Made him into a ghost story, a legend, something to tell around campfires. But there's another possibility. Maybe Johnny Appleseed didn't die in any conventional sense. Maybe whatever agreement he'd made with the wilderness had changed him so fundamentally that death became meaningless. Maybe he'd given up so much of his humanity over those 40 years that by the end, there wasn't enough mortality left in him to actually die. Or maybe the land itself remembered him. Maybe all those seeds he'd planted, all those negotiations he'd conducted, all those agreements he'd maintained had left an imprint on the American wilderness. An echo. A continuation. Maybe Johnny Appleseed stopped being a person and became something else. A pattern. A process. A presence that manifests wherever the boundary between wild and civilized grows thin enough. To this day, people hiking in old-growth forests in the Midwest sometimes report finding apple trees in impossible places. Trees that genetic analysis shows are descended from the varieties Johnny Appleseed planted. Trees that shouldn't be there, that have no clear origin, that seem to have appeared on their own. Maybe they're just escaped cultivars, spread by animals, accidents of botany. Or maybe something is still planting them. Still maintaining those old agreements. Still walking the boundary between human civilization and whatever existed before. The wilderness doesn't give up its mediators easily. Once you've learned to speak its language, once you've become a part of its ecology, it keeps you. Not as a prisoner. As a function. As a necessary component of its ecosystem. Johnny Appleseed might not have died. He might have just become fully what he'd been becoming all along. Part of the land itself. Part of the deep memory of the American wilderness. Still there, somewhere, in the quiet places between the trees. Still planting. Still negotiating. Still maintaining agreements most people will never know exist. Still walking, and walking, and walking, long after the body that started the journey has turned to dust. So let me ask you something. Who was the fool in this story? Was it Johnny Appleseed, the strange man who gave up everything to plant trees in the wilderness? Who rejected wealth, comfort, and human connection to pursue a purpose no one else could understand? Who died alone, or didn't die, or became something else entirely? Or was it everyone else? The settlers who saw the American wilderness as empty land, as resources to be extracted, as obstacles to be overcome. Who believed that civilization meant imposing human will on the natural world, crushing everything wild beneath the weight of progress and property lines. We've spent 2 centuries congratulating ourselves for conquering the continent. For turning forests into farmland, rivers into power sources, wilderness into suburbs and strip malls. We've measured progress in miles of road, tons of timber, acres of cleared land. But what if Johnny Appleseed understood something we've forgotten? What if he knew that the land wasn't something to be conquered at all? That it was something to be negotiated with, carefully, respectfully, with an understanding that every agreement has a price and every intrusion has consequences. Indigenous peoples knew this. They lived with it for thousands of years. The understanding that the land is alive, that it has its own interests, that coexistence requires constant attention and respect. They tried to tell the settlers. But the settlers weren't interested in listening. Johnny Appleseed listened. Whether he learned it from indigenous peoples, or from years alone in the wild, or from something else entirely, he learned to hear what the land was saying. And he spent 40 years trying to maintain a dialogue that almost everyone else had chosen to ignore. The version of Johnny Appleseed we tell children is sanitized, simplified, made safe for classroom consumption. We've turned him into a mascot for environmentalism, a cute symbol of conservation, a harmless eccentric who loved nature. But the real Johnny Appleseed was dangerous. Not because he threatened anyone directly, but because he represented a completely different way of understanding humanity's relationship with the natural world. A way that acknowledged the land's agency, its power, its permanence. A way that required humility instead of dominance. We couldn't handle that version of the story. So we made him into a cartoon. Gave him a pot for a hat and a sack of seeds and a friendly smile. Turned him into someone kids could dress up as for school plays. Buried everything strange and uncomfortable and true. But the truth doesn't stay buried. It resurfaces in odd places. In accounts that don't quite fit the narrative. In apple trees growing where they shouldn't. In moments when you're alone in the forest and you feel, just for a second, like something is paying attention to you. The land remembers Johnny Appleseed. Maybe it remembers him better than we do. Maybe it recognizes him as one of the few who tried to speak its language. One of the few who understood that progress isn't measured in what you take, but in what you're willing to offer in return. I'm sitting here in my climate-controlled apartment, drinking water from a plastic bottle, typing this on a device made from rare earth minerals mined from devastated landscapes. I'm as complicit in the modern relationship with nature as anyone. Maybe more so, because I've spent 3 years studying this story and I still drive to work every day, still consume without thinking, still participate in the systems that treat the natural world as a warehouse of resources waiting to be exploited. But I can't shake the feeling that Johnny Appleseed knew something essential that we've lost. That his life, strange and lonely and uncomfortable as it was, represented a kind of truth we desperately need but don't want to face. Maybe Johnny Appleseed wasn't a fool. Maybe he was just the only one paying attention. The only one who understood, early and clearly, that the land doesn't belong to those who conquer it. It belongs to those who can survive what it asks in return. And maybe, just maybe, his trees are still out there. Still marking the boundaries between our world and the older one. Still offering fruit we're not quite ready to taste. Still growing in the wild places, where the old agreements are still being honored by those wise enough or strange enough to remember they exist. The question isn't whether Johnny Appleseed was crazy. The question is whether the rest of us are sane. Whether a civilization built on the principle that nature exists to serve human needs is sustainable. Whether we can keep taking without ever giving back. Whether we can keep ignoring the voices that tried to warn us, from Johnny Appleseed to indigenous elders to the land itself. So far, we've chosen not to listen. We've chosen progress over balance, extraction over reciprocity, dominance over dialogue. We've chosen to be fools in all the ways that matter. And somewhere in the deep forests, in the quiet places where civilization hasn't quite reached yet, Johnny Appleseed is still walking. Still planting. Still maintaining agreements we'll never fully understand. Still waiting for the rest of us to figure out what he knew all along. That the wilderness doesn't need to be tamed. It needs to be heard. And the price of not listening is higher than any of us want to admit.